today's tutorial video, I'm going to show you 3 different ways to bind off. These 3 bind off methods are something that I use regularly in my work. The first one being my favorite of all of them. Second is a standard with a couple little tips in there. And then third is a crochet bind off. So let's get to it. My name is Kim of Make One Right Knit. That's m1rknit.com. We are going to start with the Ruke Bind Off. This is a sewn tubular bind off that is so much easier than the Italian bind off, and it's stretchy, which I love. So this creates kind of like this rounded effect on your fabric, and it's really pretty. I really do enjoy it. I use it primarily on cuffs and hems and things like that, so knitting in the round. And the setup for knitting flat compared to knitting in the round is a little different, and I will have those instructions for knitting in the round, or binding off in the round, sorry, on the website, so you can go and check that out at m1rknit.com. All right, so I've ended on a knit row, so we're going to turn the work so the wrong side is facing us. And then we are going to cut a tail. So the tail length, we want it to be about 4 times the width of our project. So I'm just going to give you a visual here and show you exactly what that looks like. So here is our working yarn, and we're going to estimate a long tail. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that is 4 times the width of our project. And we're going to cut our yarn there. We're going to grab our tapestry needle and load it. And now we are ready to do the bind off. So like I said, we're on the wrong side of the work, and we're going to do our setup here. And all the setup is sewing through the first 2 stitches without dropping any stitches off. So we're just going to go through these 2 stitches just like that. I'm going to pull it all the way through and kind of snug it up, because I don't like having like a really kind of fiddly thing at the edge here. So we're just going to give it a little tug, and now we're going to go through 3 stitches. So these next 2 steps is what you're going to repeat to the last 2 stitches. So we're going to go through 3 stitches like that. You can adjust everything and make sure that it's not hung up on the back of the work, and snug it up. And then drop that first stitch. And we're just going to repeat those 2 steps until we get to the end here. So again, we're going to go through those 3 stitches. Make sure that it doesn't get hung up on any of your work. And then drop the first stitch, just like that. 3 stitches again. And drop that first stitch. And you can play with it a little bit as you go to make sure that it's not too tight or too loose. So get a feel for what it looks like. And again, we're going to go through 3 stitches. My sample is pretty small, so it keeps on wanting to curl on me. And drop that first stitch. And again, you're going to go through the 3 stitches. And you're just going to repeat this until we get to the last 2. And like I said, you don't want to pull it too tight. You'll get a feel for it. And depending on your mindset while you're knitting, you might have too loose if you're relaxed, or too tight if you're anxious or stressed out. I find that my knitting, my gauge actually changes depending on how I'm feeling that day. That's why swatches lie sometimes. And sometimes the yarn will get kind of all twirly. So if you've seen, I kind of dropped the needle there and I just kind of let it unravel itself. And look at that. Look how pretty that is, hey? Isn't that nice? That's what it looks like. I really love this bind off. It's one of my favorites, especially when I'm knitting in the round. I tend to bind off too tight, and if you do the same, then this is a really nice solution to that because the Ruke Bind Off is nice and stretchy. Like, look at that. Look at the give that it has. So you're not going to have to worry about your bind off being super tight because this is a really nice stretchy bind off. Like I said, it's really nice for cuffs and things like that. All right, so we're almost at the end here. Going through 3 stitches and dropping one off. Going through 3 stitches and binding one off. Now we're at the last 2 stitches, so we're just going to go through those 2 stitches, snug it up, and drop it off of our needle. And now what we want to do is weave this end in the back of our work, so the wrong side. You don't want to weave it in the front of the work. You want to go to the back of the work and weave it in. And the way that I like to weave in my ends is I follow the stitches. So if you can see the purl bumps on the back of the work, right? But if you kind of pull it apart a little bit, you're going to see the knit stitches, right? They go this way, like that. They make that kind of looping, that loopy feel. Normally you would go in right here and weave your ends in, but I want to show you how to do that up here. So just ignore my tail here, because I know that if I bind off here that you're not going to be able to see exactly what I'm doing. So what I like to do is I will find a stitch. Do you see that? You go through these purl bumps, but I'm following the knit stitch underneath. So it kind of loops like this, right? Loops like that. So we're going to follow the stitch, the knit stitch underneath, and ignore this, right? This is, you wouldn't have this if you're binding off or you're weaving in your ends over here, but I want to show you. So we're going to follow this knit stitch this way, okay? So we're going to follow that knit stitch underneath our purl bumps. And we're going to do this about 5 or 6 times. Just like that. So you're following the knit stitches, okay? And you can't even see where we weaved in the ends. Can't see it on either side of the work. It's really nice. I would weave in more, but for time's sake, I'm just going to clip it here. And obviously you wouldn't have this big long tail here, but I wanted to show you what it looked like to weave in ends in case you were curious about that as well. Because that is actually something that I didn't learn until way later, was how to weave in ends properly, because I had my work falling apart on me, which is upsetting. So now we are going to go over a standard bind off, and I'm going to show you a couple tricks to make it nice and neat and stretchy. For this bind off method, we are just going to use our knitting needles and we're going to bind off. So before we begin though, I would like to mention that if you still find that your bind off is way too tight, which I totally am guilty of all the time. I would suggest needling up a size. So for example, I'm using a 5mm. So for the bind off, I would just swap out this needle here and I would use a 6mm to bind off. All right, so let's begin. So what we want to do to avoid that kind of like that ugly little, like, I think they're called dog ears at the beginning here, we're going to knit this first stitch. I'm going to tighten it up a little bit, and then we're going to yarn over, okay? And then what we're going to do is we're going to lift this stitch that we have already knit over our yarn over, just like that. And we're going to tighten it up just a little bit. So by doing that, we're avoiding that weird little thing that happens when we bind off. You're going to have a really nice, clean, square edge by doing that. Okay, so we're going to knit the next stitch, and then we're going to pass this second stitch over the first one that we just knit. And we're going to pull our needle apart just a little bit so it has a little bit of breathing room in there. Do you see that? And we don't want to snug it up too much, but we don't want it too loose either, because then it starts to look a little bit wonky. Oh, and another thing that I want to mention, because I'm using Stockinette, I'm just going to be knitting across. But if you have, for example, a 1x1 rib or anything like that, you want to bind off in pattern. So you knit the knits and purl the purls, okay? So we're going to carry on. We're going to knit that next stitch. And then we're going to take our second stitch again and bring it over that first stitch. And we're not going to tighten it up too much. So we can start to kind of see this edge forming, right? Isn't that pretty? I love this, especially for blankets and things like that. It's just a really nice bind off. All right, so we're going to knit that next stitch. And again, we're going to take this second loop and pass it over our first loop. Just like that. And we're going to make sure that it's not too tight. So when I pull it off, I'm lax. I'm not putting a whole bunch of tension on my hand here. I'm not tightening it while I'm going. I'm making it snug but not tight, if that makes sense. All right, we're just going to keep doing that process. Knitting and binding off. Knitting and binding off. And remember, if we have like a rib pattern, then we're going to be binding off in pattern. So for example, that would look like this. So we're going to pretend that this next stitch is a purl stitch. We're just going to make believe for a second, right? And we are going to purl this next stitch. And I use the Norwegian knitting method, by the way. So I've purled that stitch, and I'm just going to pass this next stitch over my purl stitch, just like that. And then the next one would be a knit. And again, we're going to pass that stitch over the first stitch there. And we're just going to continue doing that in pattern. But because these are all knit stitches, we can bind them off by knitting. And if you find that it's getting a little bit loose, you can tighten your tension up a little bit too. But you just want to make sure that it's not too tight. Now this bind off method, it has some stretch to it. I find that the Ruke Bind Off has more stretch, but this has a decent amount of stretch. So this is excellent for blankets and things like that. I would use the Ruke if I was binding off something that required more stretch though. So you're just going to continue in pattern by knitting one and then passing over one stitch over the other, just like that. So knit one and pass the second stitch over the first stitch, just like that. And you're just going to continue doing that until you're at the very end. And then I'm going to show you a technique that makes a really nice edge as well. So we're just going to knit up to the end here. We'll bind off until the end, sorry. All right, so we are at this last stitch, and this is how we get a really nice clean edge with this last stitch. You're going to find the stitch below. So hopefully you can see that. So if we're looking at this last stitch, so here's the loop on our needle, and then we're looking at the stitch below it. All right, we're going to take the first leg of that stitch and we're going to bring it up to our needle, just like that. And now we're going to knit through both of those stitches, just like that. And for some reason, it is really loopy today, but that's okay. It's usually very nice and clean. And then we're going to just knit one more stitch and bring it through both of the loops on our needle. And pull it all the way through, just like that. So here we go. We are done our knitted bind off, and it's nice and stretchy. And if you find that it's too stretchy, then you can adjust your tension or needle down. So say if, for example, I needled up to a size 6, then I would needle back down to a size 5, which is what I used to knit this sample. All right, so let's move on to the last bind off method, which is using a crochet hook. So it's a crochet bind off. Moving on to our last bind off method, which is the crochet bind off. I really like this bind off, especially for blankets. I probably wouldn't use this bind off for stretchy things like socks or cuffs or anything like that requires a little bit more stretch, but you can make stretch into it. And I'm going to go over a few tips on how to do that. So to begin, we're going to grab a crochet hook the same size as our knitting needles. I know that I am a more relaxed knitter crocheter, so I'm going to go a hook size down and choose a 4.5 for this. All right, to begin, I'm just going to move things out of the way. We're going to crochet our first stitch here. And I like to tug it just a little bit so it's not super tight, but it's not super loose either. And now what we're going to do is just crochet another stitch. So now that we have 2 stitches on our crochet hook, this is where it gets interesting. And it really depends on the tension that you use, like how you're tensioning your yarn with your hand, and also how you normally crochet or knit. So I know that I am more of a relaxed knitter, as I've mentioned. So what I'm going to do is, instead of yarning over and bringing that yarn over through these 2 stitches, I'm going to take this loop that is already on my hook and use it. So I'm going to take this first loop on my hook and bring it through the second loop. And I'm going to relax it. Do you see that it's not a super tight loop there? And then I'm going to continue on in this fashion until we are all bound off. So what I wanted to mention, and I love this bind off for this reason, because it is so customizable, I guess. So if you're finding that your bind off is still way too loose, What you can do is go down another hook size, but if you're finding that your bind off is way too tight, you could do one or both of these things. You can grab a larger hook, and you can also do a yarn over. So we're gonna continue binding this off. And instead of bringing this first loop through the second, we're going to yarn over and bring that through all of the stitches on our hook, just like that. So it really depends on, a lot of actually factors. And that's why it's a good idea to kind of play with this a little bit to get it just right, to get your tension just right. Because what you want, like when your piece of fabric is completely bound off. So you don't want something that fans out or that goes in. So a tension that matches your cast on edge. So say if you're making a blanket or something like that, maybe a pillow cover, the front of a pillow cover or something like that, you want to make sure that everything kind of aligns really pretty like that. And you don't want it to be too tight. You want to be relaxed with it. So you should have something that starts to look like this. Like, isn't that pretty? I've seen like right here, right? It was too loose. And right here, it's kind of perfect. But I was playing with my tension a little bit there. So when you're looking at your bind off stitches at the top here, they should all be roughly the same size and width and feel to the next one, right? So you don't want something, you don't want a bind off edge where you have like a really loose stitch and then a really tight one or whatever, because that's not going to make your work well, look good, I guess, but it's just going to kind of complicate things, I guess, and you're not going to be happy with the final result here. So we're just going to finish crocheting this off. I just love this. I really enjoy crocheting too. So I actually really love this bind off. So we're just going to continue like that until we get to the end. And I'm going to show you what we're going to do at the end here. All right, so this is our last stitch, right? So for this stitch, I'm just going to go in, wrap it around, and then I have my tail here. I actually cut it because I was working on another project, but you don't have to cut this tail when you're working these stitches, okay? But just at the very end, I've cut it. I'm going to bring it through that last loop, snug it up a little bit, and we are all done. So I really love this crochet bind off. It just finishes the work really nice, especially if you are making a blanket or something like that. So you will notice, I get this question a lot. Why is the work curling? And the reason for that is, I just wanted to touch on that really quick before I let you go. This is a stockinette stitch, and stockinette stitches will always curl unless you do a border like a ribbed border or an I-cord edge or something like that. Stockinette stitches just curl. That's just the name of the game kind of thing. So I just wanted to touch on that really quickly, but yeah. All right. So that is it for this tutorial video. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Like, comment, share, subscribe to the channel. It's all very much appreciated. And come visit me over on m1rknit.com where I have more tutorials and knitting patterns. Bye now.